Well, howdy friends, Brian Fleshig of Mad River Outfitters in the Midwest Fly Fishing Schools, and welcome to another one of our fly tying tutorials. You know, it's early April here in Ohio, and it's Hendrickson season. Kind of the start of our trout fishing season, although we fish year round, but you know, I still enjoy fishing dry flies. And the Hendrickson, as for most folks around the country, or at least here in the East, the Hendrickson is kind of kicks off the spring dry fly season. So today I thought I'd show you a Hendrickson nymph that I've been tying and fishing for a couple of years. I hesitate to say that it's something I designed. Surely I stole it, as I do most of the stuff that I tie. But it's kind of a cool pattern, maybe a little bit unique, maybe you've never seen it. And also I'll tell you, it's not an exact imitation of the Hendrickson. But I've been fishing it for, like I said, for a few years. And it's done me well. I also tie a sulfur variation. You can tie a blue wing olive variation, and it's really pretty easy, but it's a really cool fly when you get it finished. So let's jump right in. For the hook, I'm using the Tiemco 5262. I tie most of my nymphs on the 5262, bead head or not. I tie a lot of my soft tackles on that hook as well. And I'm kind of a Tiemco guy. I started using Tiemco hooks probably in the late 80s, and they've always served me well, and I've just never kind of looked elsewhere. But there's tons of other great hooks, Daiichi, several different brands. Gamakatsu, of course, makes some great hooks. But so your favorite nymph hook will work just fine. I think a 50 or a 2X shank works a little bit better. So you get your hook secured in your vise, and for my thread, I'm using 8/0 uni thread, although you can certainly, I like the Vivus, the 12/0 Vivus too. I use that on this fly occasionally, but again, I'm not a big thread guy. I kind of just use what's there. But either the 8/0 or the 12/0 Vivus seems to work pretty good on this fly. And as usual, you're going to start your thread and lay a base of thread all the way down and trim right at the barb. And then for the tail on this, we're going to use Coq de Leon from Whiting Farms. And if you're not familiar with this stuff, man, I love it. It's really cool stuff. And I use a lot of the hen. They offer it in Whiting Farms offers it in rooster or hen. In fact, there's a really cool story. It's the oldest known breed of bird that was actually raised for the purpose of fly tying. In fact, on the package, there's a whole big story. Maybe we'll post it on our blog with some links for you to read it. But I use Coq de Leon for a ton of stuff. I use it for tails and legs. I use it for throats. I use it for soft tackles on both small and large flies. I've been tying matukas with it. And for the Hendrickson, I use just the standard brown speckled Coq de Leon hen saddle. Okay, so I'm going to pull a feather off, which I've already done here. And I'm just going to grab, again, one of my favorite terms in fly tying is the scientific amount of a bunch. Maybe about, say, like a hook gap's worth of the fibers, and I cut them right off the quill there. And then I'm going to lay them right along the hook shank. I want my tail to be right about the same length as the shank of the hook. And I'm going to use my pinch method to lash that to the top of the hook shank. And then I'll wrap my thread back to the bend of the hook. Okay? And there I've got my tail. It's maybe a little thicker than most, but man, you're just going to see it's got that really buggy mottled look. Really looks cool. Okay, and the next thing we're going to tie in is a little rib. We're going to use standard fine copper wire. Switch my scissors to my synthetic scissors for cutting the wire. I don't want to do that with my fine point. By the way, these are, I'm using the Dr. Slick for a lot of my fine work. Dr. Slick micro tip, I believe, arrow scissors. And I really, really go out of my way to not cut wire in thicker materials. So I've got a standard pair of tungsten carbide for multi-purpose work, and then I've got my synthetic scissors here for cutting wire and really heavy stuff. So I've always got several pairs of scissors close by. And I just cut myself a piece of that copper wire I'm going to lay it on the hook shank, wrap it in so it doesn't come loose, and I wind up with my thread back at the bend of the hook. Okay, and I've got maybe 3 inches extending back here now. Now for the body, we're going to use standard quill body like you use for dry flies. And if you've ever worked with this stuff before, you know that you want to soak it in water for, I usually do it for 3, 4, 5 minutes, something like that, before I tie. So when you know that you're going to be tying some of these nymphs, if you're going to tie a half dozen of them, before you get started, put a half dozen of them in this water. And I just use a little Tupperware container here, fill it with a ½ inch of water, and I soak the quills. So I'm gonna pull that quill out, let a little bit of the water drain off. And I don't tie it in exactly by the tip of this quill, by the thinnest part. I usually trim off a little bit. I would say if I had to guess, I'm going to trim off about 1 inch to 1.5 inches. Because what this does is it gives the thorax of this, the abdomen, the abdomen of this bug, it gives it a really cool segmentation. And if you start with the very tip, it's not really pronounced. In fact, on the Hendricksons, I'll cut back to a certain thickness. On my sulfurs, a little bit different, which are smaller. And then the blue wing olives, maybe you go a little further out on the tip to start this body. But all I'm going to do is just tie that right in, just like I did the copper wire. And I'm going to lash that to the hook shank. Make sure I wrap it all the way back to the bend. And now I can bring the thread forward to approximately the halfway point on that hook shank. And now I'm simply going to take this quill and I'm going to start start spiraling it forward. And you want to be very careful with the placement so you get one wrap butted right up against the next. And there we go. Sometimes rocking it back and forth kind of helps get it in the right place. And you'll notice that as the quill gets thicker, it kind of gives you a semblance of some taper to this body. I didn't quite get that wrap where I wanted it. And we'll go one more. You can always go a little bit further than the midway point of the hook shank because we can come back over it with thread anyways and cover it with the thorax, this fly. So I hold it in place and I throw my thread over maybe 4 or 5 times. I want to ensure that that doesn't come loose. Trim it off there and I can put a few security wraps over that butt just to hold it in place. Now I'm going to take the copper wire and I'm going to rib it just like you would any nymph. I go with the flow, so to speak. I don't counter wrap on this. A lot of times I'll counter wrap, meaning I go the opposite direction, say on a pheasant tail. But on this one, I just like how it looks a little bit better. And then I like how it falls in place right here at that tie-off point. So I tie it off, making sure I didn't use my fine point scissors for that. Just kind of fold it over and put a couple of security wraps. Now here's the part that makes this nymph look really cool. A few years ago, I started using this UV stuff. I kind of turned my nose up at it for a few years, and it was just kind of the thing all the kids were doing. And now I hardly tie a fly without putting UV finish on it. It's crazy, and it just makes, there isn't a nymph that I tie anymore that doesn't have UV on it. It's really kind of crazy. So I'm just going to just put a thin coat of this UV resin, a little bit on the top, make sure you rub a little bit on the sides, and just a little bit along the bottom of it. Just enough to give it a little candy coating. And then I grab my UV light, hit it. Really just takes a few seconds. I usually give it about 15 or 20 seconds just to be sure. I rotate the light around. And it just, man, I think it's really killer looking. And like I said, this is a pretty simple nymph, but I've had pretty good luck with it. So there is your abdomen, and now we're going to build the thorax on this fly. And I have also become a huge fan of thin skin. I use this thin skin on almost all my wing cases on my nymphs anymore. And what I'm going to do is just cut a section, and I would say the width of this little section I'm going to cut out, I would say is about the width of the hook gap, or about the same as the hook gap, maybe a little thinner. And you don't need much, just about 3/4 of an inch, something like that. So I cut a little strip. And then I'm also going to cut a little triangle at the end, which gives me a tie-in point. It allows me to tie it in, and then also when I go to fold it over, it doesn't bulge out on me. You'll kind of see what I mean. But I give it a pretty good little angle there to give myself a point and then somewhat of a taper. And you should see in the close-ups there that I've just kind of created a little triangle, a little point to this. Now I peel off the backing. It's got a little cardboard backing, and that just gives me the thin skin. Toss that to the side. There's really not a good side and a bad side to this stuff, but you'll notice it kind of has a natural curvature once I peel that backing off. So I go with that curvature pointing up. And then I'm going to tie this in right at the midpoint of the hook shank. Trying my best to keep it on top of the hook shank. And see, I rolled over just a pinch, but you can kind of usually use your thumbnail and roll it back into good position. And then I want to wrap back over that, back to the midpoint of the hook shank. You can kind of use your scissor points to measure. I might even take another turn or two towards the rear of the hook. As you know, a mature nymph this time of year, his wing case is going to be pretty pronounced, and we want to accentuate that. So actually I'm going to go another wrap towards the bend over top of that thin skin. And you can also kind of test your proportions just by folding it over and imagining what's going to be. In fact, I need to go another turn or two back towards the bend. That should be good. Another thing we want to be aware of, we're going to put legs on this. We're going to use the Coq de Leon to put legs on. So you want to be sure that you don't crowd the head, as with all flies that you tie. But you really want to be cautious, because you got to tie off this thin skin and yet put some legs on the front of it. So I'm maybe even a little further than the halfway point on the hook shank with my thread. And what I've done again is I've wrapped backwards now over top of the thin skin and that quill body to get my proportion right. Okay, now we're going to dub the thorax with some ice dub. And I use golden brown ice dub for this Hendrickson pattern. Okay, and with ice dub, as with any dubbing, you want to be very, very sparse with this stuff. Ice dub is not the easiest to work with, but especially if you get too much on there, it becomes a mess. So very sparse. I probably got a little too much in that one. And I'm probably going to do a rope here somewhere around 2.5, 3 inches, something like that. Of course, this is a size 14 hook. I don't remember if I mentioned that. Most Hendricksons around here are size 14. And with this stuff, I can kind of double back on itself to give myself the right proportion, the right size. I might even add just a pinch more, one more layer, call it. Because again, I want that wing case to be nice and pronounced. And again, notice that I've left myself plenty of room right there at the head. I'm not crowding the eye on this. going over itself and giving myself a nice ball of dubbing there. And now I'm going to fold that wing case over. I'm going to hold it in place and tie it down. Now, as I start to lash that down to hold it in place, I'm making sure that I'm wrapping my thread back towards the bend of the hook, okay? Because when I come in with my scissors to trim that, if I do, and which I do occasionally, nick that thread, chances are that it's not going to come completely unraveled on me, okay? So I've got about 3 or 4 security wraps, again wrapping back towards the bend. I come in and I lift that thin skin up, exposing the eye of the hook, and then I should be able to come in and get my scissors right up against the hook eye and trim that good. There's a little extra hanging out there. I can use my fine points to get it. And we should be in pretty good shape just to kind of clean up that area right behind the eye. Okay, just a few security wraps to hold it into place. And there you've got your thin skin folded over your ice dub thorax. And of course, I'm going to add more UV. I'm going to go 1 stripe along the side, 1 stripe down the middle, 1 stripe down that side. That's usually enough. You can kind of fill in the gaps there. Hit it with the light. Looks like I'm needing some new batteries. Hit it real good with that light, and you should have a nice hard candy shell over top of that. And if you can see in the close-ups on this, which I'm sure we'll be showing you, I just think that is one sexy looking nymph. And so do the trout in the Mad River, at least, which is mostly where I get to fish Hendricksons, is right here on our home river here in Ohio. So the last step on this is we're going to put some legs, and we're going to put legs on each side. So this can be a little tedious, not really a trick to it, but just a little tedious. So I grab, I would say, the same, about the same bunch, about a hook gap's worth, so I can kind of measure, take my scissor points, come in and cut that much off. I want to kind of make sure that the tips are kind of even, although it's absolutely not critical. And now I'm just going to lay this little bunch, kind of measuring, roughly measuring, although I'll show you that you can adjust it after you make a few security wraps. And I'll hold it in place. You notice that I rotated the vise just a pinch. I rotated the vise so I have a nice view of the side of that fly. Now making sure I don't unravel my wraps there, I can kind of check the length of that. And it looks a little long to me, so I only took 2 security wraps, so I can kind of pull those legs into place. That looks about right. And I'll put 1 more security wrap there. Now, we're going to repeat that process on the other side of the hook shank. Okay, so we're going to grab a similar sized bunch from my Coq de Leon feather. Again, kind of even up the tips, although not critical. And then I'm going to rotate the hook the opposite way so I can get a nice clean shot at this side. I'm going to hold the legs right there in position behind the eye, get a pinch method and an extra wrap. And then if I need to make a slight adjustment, I can pull on the butts and try to get each side even. Now, you'll notice that both of the bunches are kind of sticking up above the nymph. As I go to finish this now, I can take my thumb and my index finger, kind of move them to the underside of the hook shank, so I'm kind of placing them as I make my security wraps. And you should have those legs kind of placed right along the sides of the nymph. Of course, it's not absolutely critical. They don't have to be perfect, but I like it to look nice and proportionate. Okay, so now I'm going to come in with my fine point scissors, and I'm going to come in and trim as close as possible, making sure that you're not covering up the eye. And just get those butts out of the way. You give yourself a couple of security wraps, and by wrapping right behind the eye, I can kind of clear some of those butts out of the way. And then you're going to use your whip finisher, your half hitch tool. For those of you that have seen me here before, you know that I typically like to use half hitches. This is the Stonfo half hitch tool, which has different size tubes that I can slide in there. And of course I'm using the smallest tube right here. And then I can slide my half hitch over. And just even by doing that, I opened up my eye a little bit better. I should be good to go. I put 2 half hitches, tug on it for a second, and then trim that thread, and bada bing. I certainly, seems that I forgot my head cement today, but I'm going to certainly take a bodkin and put a little dab of head cement right on the head of that fly. Okay. So I also do this, as I mentioned, in a sulfur variation, which comes right on the heels of our Hendricksons. And for the sulfur variation, on the tail and the legs, I use the Coq de Leon, and I believe they call it fluorescent green chartreuse. It just adds a really sexy look to it. I use sulfur colored quill bodies, and then for the dubbing, I use ice dub in olive. If you're going to put a bead on it, I go with the caddis green, and I step down a size, the 7/64 size in the beads. And of course, I tie my sulfurs on mostly size 16 hooks, same hook. And then if you want to do a blue wing olive variation, I would use the same fluorescent chartreuse on the Coq de Leon, and then you could go to a BWO blue wing olive quill, and then I would also stick with the olive ice dub. So, but it's just a basic formula for a nymph with the Coq de Leon tail and legs. You've got the quill body that's ribbed with some sort of wire. Oh, the other thing is I go to silver wire for the ribbing on my sulfurs and the blue wing olives. So you can do whatever you want, play around with it, but it's just a really sexy looking nymph pattern that has served me well, and it's relatively easy to tie. A sexy little Hendrickson nymph that catches a ton of fish. A variation, a lot of folks like bead heads on their flies, as do I. And so a variation is that I put a pink bead. This is the Flyman Nymph Head beads. It's called Shrimp Pink, and this is the 1/8 inch size. So what I do, really the only difference is I'm going to slide that bead on before I start to tie the fly. I do everything the same, with the exception of I put a little dubbing behind the bead. After I tie the thin skin and I put some dubbing on, then I tie off my thread, and then I come in front of the bead and start the thread again and put a little dubbing in front of it to hold it in place. Okay, now you usually wind up kind of gobbling up that dubbing in front, but what that does is it keeps the bead in place, and you should see, we should have some pictures of the bead head version here. But that just puts that pink bead in, man, it looks really sexy. You know, I don't know if the fish are actually looking at it saying, a Hendrickson or a sulfur, but it's just a great little, we could call it a red quill nymph if you want, or in a sulfur quill nymph, a blue wing olive quill nymph. I've really never given it a name, but there you go, the Hendrickson or red quill nymph. As always, friends, thanks for watching. Should be some links and step-by-step on our blog and down below in the comments. And if you ever have any questions, don't hesitate to give us a call here at Mad River Outfitters. Thanks for watching, and be sure to subscribe. We've got a lot more coming at you.